distinguished guest, to say the least. Talking about the wars, we have two from the Second World War, one from the Korean War primarily. There's also the Vietnam and Tom Hunter, and then we have one from the Vietnam War, Bill Tobin. Just very briefly, and then John Gilman, who I discovered is really Cram's historian, will go into more detail. Number one, Hank Wilayto, who I met through the church in West Concord, and now it's Holy Family. It's Wilayto, right, Hank?
Wilayto.
Wilayto, I'll get it straight.
L-A-Y is late. We learned that in high school.
Hank is 89 years young, and he was a staff sergeant. He rose to staff sergeant, but he was stationed in the Philippines from 1940 on, and then he was there December 8th, which people might have forgotten. The Japanese attacked the Philippines the next morning after Pearl Harbor.
Actually, I'd just like to give a little bit of a timeline here in terms of the World War II oral histories that we're going to receive this morning. We go back, we're all probably, I don't know, little kids at that time, but it was December of 1941, Pearl Harbor, December 7th. And that morning, 6 battleships were sunk in a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. 4 of them were eventually brought back up, but 2 of them never did come back up. The Arizona was blown to pieces. Oklahoma turned over. Over 2,000 men, women, some citizens, and they weren't all military, died that morning. And it was right after that, in the Philippines, where we had an army of over 120,000 men, that the Japanese had another surprise air attack. And they wiped out, we had quite an air force in the Philippines, but it all got wiped out in one gigantic attack at Clark Field. And it was, I think, middle of December, December 16th, the Japanese actually invaded the Philippines. And our troops held out for 4 months. Actually, if you add in Corregidor, it was 5 months. And this is very valuable time in allowing us, you know, the arsenal of democracy to get ourselves geared up. But the terrible events at the end of the Philippines campaign in Bataan, we wound up with 75,000 soldiers that became prisoners of war of the Japanese. And they had to march without interruption 60 miles to Camp O'Donnell, where they were going to be interred by the Japanese. Now, I was telling Bob Baldwin this morning, years ago, I used to go on that March for Hunger, you know, the march from Boston out in the back end, which was about 25 miles. And I was a much younger man than I am right now. And I would feel, when I got back home, and I played sports and all, I felt pretty well worn out. I'll tell you, my hands were a little bit swollen, my feet were tired, and to think of these men having to go 60 miles, malnutrition, disease, wounds, and in many cases, brutal guards. Some of the guards weren't bad, a lot of them were bad. That day, or during that period of time, it was more than a day to get there. Out of the 75,000, only 54,000 actually made it to Camp O'Donnell. Half of them were dead. The other half actually escaped, a lot of them. They were able to, during the march, a lot of them were able to get off into the bushes and actually later became the guerrillas in the Philippines. But the Army survived another 5 weeks into the month of May on Corregidor. They held out, there were 13,000 men that held out into May. And coming back to the people that wound up at Camp O'Donnell, of the 54,000 that made it, in 4 months, 40% of them were dead. dead from disease, dead from malnutrition, dead from the results of the abuse that they'd had on the march. Well, we're going to have, what we have here for guests this morning are two real American heroes. I will tell you that after that 6 months, I guess the only good news that we can say, that in May, after Corregidor fell, it was the Battle of the Coral Sea. And that was the first step back. And then in June, there was the Battle of Midway. This is only about 7 months after the war started. And that was a real turning point. Our carriers blew the Japanese right out of the water, sank 4 of the carriers, Japanese carriers, that were at Pearl Harbor. And from that time forward, our march began across the Pacific. In August, 1st Marine Division landed at Guadalcanal. And after that, it was just a march on to Tokyo with a lot of blood, a lot of hard times, a lot of courageous acts in between. But we want to start off this morning, I think, welcoming Hank. If you could tell us that, reading about that death march, I mean, it's just amazing.
What do you do with this?
Just talk into it.
Sing.
You know how to do that. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for inviting me. I don't know why, but you can read and go to the library and get a book and read about all this. But anyway, can you hear me without
No, the mic isn't on.
The mic is for me.
Oh, the mic is for you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I've only done this a couple, 3 times in the past 50 years, so I don't know what the heck it's all about. I have to write it down. So you forgive me if I'm stumbling all over the words I can't read. Okay, I enlisted when I was a young guy in Denver in December of 1940. I was in Denver thinking that I was going to go to college in Denver, and it didn't work out. So I went to work, and eventually I joined the Army in December of 1940. They sent us by train to Fort McDowell in San Francisco, and we stayed there a few days. 5,000 of us in one barracks, one building, 4 high beds. It was quite a crowd. So we finally got on the ship and went to Manila, and I arrived in Manila in February of '41, and I spent 8 months in the camp called Camp John Hay, up in Baguio, the capital of the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Beautiful. We're on a golf course. My window looked out on the golf course. We played golf. We only worked in the morning. Afternoons, after lunch, we were through. You'd come in to eat breakfast in the morning, and they'd say to you, "What do you want for breakfast?" Well, you know, whatever you got, eggs, bacon. "How many eggs do you want?" "Well, I don't know. How many can I have?" "You can have all you want." Imagine that, being in the Army, telling you can have all you want. Well, you had 6 eggs, fried eggs, put right in front of you. And I came from kind of a limited background when I joined the Army, so I'm starting to feel like a king. So anyway, we spent a few months there, and the war broke out. So the colonel decided that we should march out of Camp John Hay and go down and meet the rest of the Army. And so we left and went through the jungle, 4 abreast. And you know, they didn't give us any food. They didn't let us fill canteens up with water. They had junior officers, reserve officers, that were running the camp. the colonel stayed back at Camp John Hay. He didn't come, so there was nobody that knew what to do with a group of men walking through the jungle. So we wandered around until we finally got down to a place called Aratao, about 80 miles from Camp John Hay. We walked through jungles in that 80 miles. They talk about the death march, 60 miles, so this was 80. No food. We stopped at one village, a native village, where they wore loincloths and Boob McNutt hats. And they had a big cannibal pot, and they killed a pig, about a 300-pound pig, and they fed us boiled pig in the middle of the night. And no dishes. We asked for dishes, and they gave us rotten, rusted pie plates. So we couldn't use them, put the food on that. So you take a handful of rice and hold it against your stomach, and then with your right hand you dip quick into the pot cooking with the pig in it, grab a piece and put it on, and then lick your fingers because they were burned. So we ate that night. We had all the pig you wanted to eat. And then the next day we got organized and got together, and we started marching through the woods and the jungle. And we came out about, like I said, around 60, 80 miles away from Camp John Hay. We got on a bus, 150 miles down the main highway, highway number 5, and the Japanese were on both sides of the highway on roads that were parallel with 5, and we didn't know it. We just saw vehicles, you know. We saw buildings burning and everything where they were going down and you know, wrecking everything. So we got through and got to Cabanatuan River, and the bridge was down. Well, how are we going to get across the bridge? There's no boats. But the bridge was a bunch of pyramids crossing the river. So we got on our hands and knees and we crawled over these pyramids, being careful not to slip off, and got onto the other side. And then they marched us out to a camp that they had, and then we went back into the army again and did whatever we were told. But it was kind of, you know, you were young. You didn't have the experience of, say, 30-year-olders, and you didn't know what to do. We didn't have any officers who were trained on how to handle difficult situations because there was no war before this happened, and there was no training. You know, you just had do your ordinary drill in camp, and that was the training you got. So finally, things got settled down, and we'd do the best we could. We were in the jungle, so we'd cut the trees around and leave 4 bamboo poles, still growing, and then we chop them off at the top, and we'd throw a shelter half over those 4, and then take a rope and make a mattress out of the rope, and that's what you slept on while you were there in that camp. So, you know, you did the best you could with the native intelligence that you had, and you got to learn the best you could. I ought to get back to what really happened here. I got it written down, and we had, like I said, we had a 150-mile ride on the bus to Cabanatuan, and we missed 500 Japanese who were on bicycles following us, and we didn't know it. And this one thing, nice thing that happened, we stopped at a town, and we were quartered with civilians and families, and I was in this family's house, and I asked if I could have, you know, a bath or a shower or something. They said, sure. So they showed me where the shower was. I went in and taken a shower, and in comes a 13-year-old girl while I'm in the shower carrying a bucket of hot water to bring in so I could have it for my shower. I mean, I'm an innocent kid. So anyway, we, what the heck did we do? Some of this isn't. Well, what happened was that we then got out and we got into a group, and we either had buses to go on or we walked, depending on what the situation was. And we finally got into Bataan and got organized. I ended up working on the grave detail. I was in charge of burials. And so I would take a truck and half a dozen workers, and we'd go out to where the dead Americans were, and we'd pick them up and then bring them down to the cemetery in the town. And that's what my job was all the time we were there. Then we took off again and marched quite a distance, and we finally got into a prison camp. The marches were very brutal. You've heard of the death march. If you fell and you didn't have any buddies to pick you up and help you along, the Japanese would bayonet or shoot you because nobody helped you up. So we lost quite a number of people that way. And finally, we got into one area where we had to stop, and it was a cattle compound where they had cattle, and naturally they did their duty in the compound, and we had to lay down in that and try and get some sleep. And we were packed shoulder to shoulder, and there was no room. There wasn't enough room for everybody to lay down, so half would lay down, half would sit down, and some would stand up. And you spent the night that way, and then the next day they put you in rail cars, and they put 100 guys to each rail car, and this was the Philippines, and the temperature is 100, and you're up against the side of the rail car, you're burning. Your skin gets burned. So it was really rough, and you couldn't stop the train and go to the latrine. There weren't any, so you defecated right in the car or urinated right in the middle of your 100 people. So, and I mean, there was no way of taking your pants down and doing your duty. You just did it in your pants. So imagine 100 guys in a car like that and going through all of that. So finally we got to camp, and they gave us wooden slatted beds. Whoops. And just back out of the way. We got these slatted beds with a shelter half on it, and that was your bed. And we made out on that for a while, and then we got moved to other camps, and with there we had mattresses, and so we finally got into a natural existence. I ended up I started to work in a farm, working in the farm and helping to grow things that provided food for the prisoners and for the Japanese. And then I got transferred to Port area, and I worked as a stevedore. That's where the fun began. When we worked on the ship, we'd be loading rice, 200-pound sacks of rice in the hold of the ship to be taken to Japan. Well, there were no guards in the hold where we were working because it was too hot and uncomfortable. So we take out our knives and rip the sacks open. And probably the first 2 or 3 layers of sacks about this high would be slit. When the ship went out and the waves hit, the rice would move and the ship would start going this way. We don't know whether the Japs lost any ships or not, but we know when they got to Singapore, the British got accused of ruining the rice, and they got beat up by the Japanese. Well, we didn't think that was bad. because they surrendered with their rifles on their shoulders, standing in order, perfect parade order, and surrendered to the Japanese without firing a shot. So he said, good enough for them. They didn't fight. You know, that's battle humor, right? So anyway, we, as stevedores, we damaged as much as we could in the produce that we were working with, loading and unloading things, and we stole everything we could. We wore raincoats, long raincoats, every day, sun or no sun. And we tied this, you know, the old army raincoats had a strap around the wrist. We tied those so we could fill the sleeves with food and throw the raincoat over our shoulder. And anything we could steal that was edible or valuable, we would steal from the Japanese. So if we felt we were, you know, Alexander Dumas said, if you steal a horse from the enemy, you're fighting the enemy. They've reduced by one horse, so we reduced them by all the food we could steal. So anyway, and then if you got anything of value, you could trade it. And cigarettes were the most valuable thing that you could own, because you could buy almost anything that anybody had if you had cigarettes to trade. Well, that went on for quite a while, 3.5 years. And one day, I'm up in Japan. I'd been transferred from Manila to Japan, and I was working in a nickel mine, surface mine. We didn't have to go underground. We were lucky. And we're mining nickel ore. And one day, the Japanese were not watching us, the guards, and they were gathering together in little groups and talking to each other. We sat down. You never sat down in front of a guard, and nobody bothered us. About 3:30 that afternoon, one Japanese worker there, or guard, threw his right leg in the air, and his slipper came off, and then he threw the left leg in the air, slipper came off, and he ran like hell out of the camp. And nobody bothered us. Nobody came to talk to us. Nobody said, hey, you know, you gotta work. So finally, about 3:30 in the afternoon, the Americans came around doing the V signal. And then they told us that the war was over that afternoon. That was about the 15th of August, I think, in 44. Anyway, 45. So we wandered into camp, and they had killed a big, fat, 300-pound animal, either a cow or a pig or something. And we had a tremendous meal that night. And all the Japanese signs were taken down, and we were free. And two of the guards that were kind of tough were still left in the camp. And we had some buildings with 2 stories, and 2 of our pretty sharp guys were, and kind of healthy looking, were sitting on their bunk up on the 2nd floor, and this Japanese guard, who was kind of rough on us, came up to them and said, shaking hands, Tojo, Roosevelt, friends.
Yeah.
And this kid stood up. He was good shape. He socked him in the jaw and knocked him down. And the guy jumped up and ran downstairs. He leaped the last few steps, lost his slippers, and went out through a window. Didn't even wait to run around to the door. And that was the end of the war. We were free from then on. Food came around. They got food somewhere. Plenty of rice, all the rice you could eat. And the end came. And, you know, when you don't have anybody bothering you, you sit around and talk. And finally they came around and said, we don't have any way of getting you guys out of your camp. Commandeer 2 trains and come to Yokohama. So we did. We got on the 2 trains, had about 800 prisoners. And we went to Yokohama. We got off there, and they made us sit on benches in the railroad station where we got off, and 8 beautiful, gorgeous women in Army uniforms came up and stood in front of us and apologized for not meeting our train. So they got tied up and they couldn't get over in time. But we're here to greet you. Welcome back. Imagine that, from devastation to beautiful women. So anyway, we got on the train and got back to American control, and we got home. Although they said I wasn't an American, I wasn't a U.S. citizen, I wasn't a soldier, therefore I couldn't go home. What's going on here? Well, I had to wait 18 days until they found my records in Washington and proved that I was. Then they let me go, but all my buddies were all gone 18 days before me. So anyway, I started on my way home, and part of the trip was on a ship to get to the States. And when we were on the ship, they stopped at one port, and a ice cream vendor, remember the half pints of Hood's ice cream? It cost a nickel back before the war. Well, no, these were little packages of half pints, not the round Hoodsies. And I ate 15 of them. 15. One more, I would have had a gallon. I don't know how I stuffed that much in my stomach.